Before I start tonight, I want you to think about what a prison actually is. Not the version from documentaries or court dramas, but the physical reality of the place. Thick concrete poured a century ago. Walls that haven't shifted since the men who built them were alive. Corridors so long that the far end disappears into shadow, even in full daylight and in the dark. The darkness is total. The specific kind of dark that has weight to it. The kind you can feel pressing back when you walk into it. Cell doors made of iron, each one designed to be opened only from the outside. Each one built around a single principle. What goes in does not come out unless someone decides to let it. Now imagine you are the only one who can make that decision. You are the guard, the keeper, the last person standing between order and the particular chaos of a building full of locked doors and things that should not be free. You have done this job for years. You know every sound this building makes, the ventilation cycling, the distant clanging of a loose fitting 4 blocks over, the way the old intercom system pops when the temperature drops. You know the difference between the sounds of the living and the sounds of an empty building settling in the cold? And then one night between midnight and morning, something makes a sound you have never heard before. Not a random noise, not a mechanical failure. A sound with intention behind it. A sound that responds when you respond. A sound that knows your name and says it in the voice of someone who has been dead for 6 months. Welcome to True Terror Files Official. We have 3 accounts tonight from correctional workers, from Angola, from Ohio, from Indiana, who spent years inside those walls and encountered something that the official reports were never designed to describe. These are their stories, told as close to their exact words as we could get them. Names have been changed. The buildings are real. Check your doors and stay with us. Prisons are among the oldest continuously occupied buildings in America. Some of them have been standing since before the Civil War, built from stone and iron by men whose names nobody remembers, on land that carried its own history before a single brick was laid. Angola State Penitentiary in Louisiana sits on an 18,000-acre former plantation. Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield opened in 1896 and held inmates until 1990, when a federal judge ordered it closed after finding conditions too severe. The Holbrook Correctional Facility in rural Indiana decommissioned in 2019, slated for demolition, processed over 40,000 inmates during its 71 years of operation. These are not abstract numbers. Each one of those numbers represents a person who lived inside those walls, who slept inside those cells, who in some cases died there in the infirmary, in solitary, on the execution table, and whose last memory of this world was stone and iron and the sound of a door that would not open from the inside. We do not know what, if anything, remains in a place like that after the people are gone. We do not know whether the weight of what happened inside those walls leaves any kind of mark on the building itself. What we know is that 3 separate people, a correctional officer who had worked the death row wing for 12 years, a night administrator alone in a building full of history, and a structural engineer doing a solo final inspection, each encountered something on the night shift that they have spent years trying to explain away and never managed to. This is True Terror Files Official, and tonight we are going inside. Victor had worked the death row wing at Angola State Penitentiary for 12 years. And in that time he had developed the particular kind of steady that the job requires, not the absence of feeling, but the management of it, the ability to keep it in a separate room inside yourself and close that door before you begin your shift. Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the United States. Built on the grounds of a former plantation in a bend of the Mississippi River, surrounded on 3 sides by water and on the 4th by the Tunica Hills, a location that makes escape nearly impossible and makes the isolation feel total, even in the middle of the day. Victor worked the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift on Tier D. The death row housing unit, a corridor of single-occupancy cells with a central walkway. Fluorescent lights on a half-power overnight cycle, and a climate control system that had never quite worked correctly since a flooding incident in 2018. He had walked that corridor thousands of times. He knew the sound his own footsteps made on the concrete, knew the way the light flickered near cell 8, knew the exact temperature at which the ventilation fan in the ceiling of cell 14 began to rattle, a specific, slightly off-rhythm rattle that he had long ago stopped hearing consciously, the way you stop hearing a clock in a room you've been in long enough. Cell 14 had been empty for 7 months when the first thing happened. The previous occupant, a man named Gerald, 58 years old, who had spent 11 years on death row and died of a cardiac event in his sleep on a Tuesday in October, had been quiet in the specific way of men who had accepted their circumstances completely. He and Victor had spoken every night for 7 years. Victor had been the one to find him when the cardiac monitor alarmed. He had filed the paperwork. He had stripped the cell the next morning. Cell 14 had been empty, cleaned, and sealed on protocol hold since October. By the following May, Victor had stopped noticing the empty cell the way you stop noticing anything on a route you walk every night. And that is precisely when the food slot began opening. The food slot on cell 14 was a spring-loaded steel panel at waist height, designed to be operated from the exterior walkway only. You pressed a lever, the slot opened outward. You slid the tray through. You released the lever. The spring snapped it shut. From inside the cell, the slot had no mechanism. It was a flat steel surface, smooth on the interior face, with no grip and no leverage point. Victor confirmed this himself by going inside the empty cell with a flashlight on the 3rd morning in a row that he had found the slot standing open on his 4 a.m. check open at its full extension. The spring lever depressed as though held by a steady external hand. Though the corridor was empty and the camera footage showed nothing approaching, the cell between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., he filed a maintenance request. The response came back 4 days later. Spring mechanism shows no fault. Lever arm tension within standard parameters. No mechanical reason for self-actuation. The slot continued opening. Victor began varying the timing of his rounds, approaching cell 14 from different directions at different intervals to try to catch the moment it happened. He never did. On camera review, the corridor would show the slot closed. And then Victor would arrive, and the slot would be open, and there was no footage of the transition. Then, on a Thursday in June, during his 2 a.m. round, the intercom speaker mounted outside cell 14, a standard issue unit identical to the speakers at every other cell, connected to the central PA system through which Victor could make announcements from the guard station at the end of the corridor, produced a sound. Not a broadcast. Not Victor's voice from the guard station. The speaker activated locally from cell 14's position at a volume just loud enough to carry to where Victor stood 6 cells away, but said his name. Not Gardner Hay, his first name, the name he used with exactly 4 people in the world, none of whom had ever been inside Angola. The voice was Gerald's. Victor had heard Gerald's voice every night for 7 years. He was completely certain. He stood in the corridor for a period of time he later estimated at 3 minutes, though it felt much longer, and then he turned and walked to the guard station and sat down and did not move for 45 minutes. When he finally made himself go back and check cell 14, the food slot was closed. It was the first morning in 3 weeks it had been closed at 4 a.m. check. He never heard the voice again. He submitted his transfer request the following Monday. Victor completed his final shift on Tier D6 weeks after the voice. He told the story once to his supervisor, who wrote it into an incident log as possible auditory anomaly. Officer fatigue, no corroborating evidence. He told it again 3 years later to a researcher he trusted. And it was that researcher who eventually passed it to us. What Victor has said consistently across every telling is not that he believes in ghosts or in the paranormal or in any system of belief that makes the experience easier to hold. What he says, specifically and deliberately, is that he knows what Gerald's voice sounded like. 12 years of nightly interaction is more than enough contact. To know a person's voice the way you know the sound of your own front door, and that what he heard in that corridor at 2 a.m. was Gerald's voice saying his name, from inside an empty cell with a food slot that had been opening and closing for 3 weeks without mechanical cause, and that no explanation he has been offered in the years since has accounted for all of those facts simultaneously. He says this in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man who has processed something for a long time and come to a resting place with it that is not peace exactly, but is as close to peace as the facts of the situation allow. He transferred to a minimum security facility. He still works corrections. He has never requested a night shift assignment since leaving Angola. He told us at the end of his account that every time he finds a door open when it should be closed, he still checks who was last inside. Karen was the night administrative coordinator at Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, a title that meant, in practical terms, that she was the last staff member in the building on certain evenings, completing inventory records, maintenance logs, and event scheduling for the facility's second life as a museum and filming location after its closure as a functional prison in 1990. The reformatory is a Gothic revival structure of unusual scale, 6 stories of stone, with a central administrative tower, 2 flanking wings of cell blocks, and an interior that the state of Ohio has. Since 2008, listed among the most historically significant correctional structures in the country, was also the filming location for The Shawshank Redemption, a fact that had always struck Karen as vaguely ironic given the building's actual history. The 215 documented deaths on the property, the solitary confinement wing known as the Hole, where prisoners were kept in complete darkness for extended periods. The administrative records that detailed conditions a federal court eventually described as constitutionally unacceptable. Karen worked 3 overnight administrative shifts per week. Este was not a person who startled easily. She was a bookkeeper by training, methodical, detailer, inted, with a preference for silence that made the empty building feel like a feature rather than a liability. I had worked there for 4 years without incident. On a Wednesday in late November, alone in the administrative office on the 2nd floor of the central block, she heard the intercom system activate. This requires a specific piece of context. The Ohio State Reformatory's original intercom system, a 1940 SRI broadcast network connecting the administrative offices to speakers throughout the cell blocks, had been decommissioned in 1991 and physically disconnected in 2003 when the building underwent its first major renovation. The wiring had been removed. The speaker housings remained in place as historical features, but they were not connected to anything. There was no power source, no transmitter, no broadcast capability of any kind. Karen knew this. She had helped catalog the renovation records. The speaker on the wall of the administrative office, a round metal grill mounted above the doorframe, had not functioned in over 20 years. At 1:47 a.m., it crackled. The crackle of an old speaker coming to life, the specific textured pop of an analog system waking up, filled the silent office, and then a voice began reading names. Male voice, flat cadence, institutional. The way a corrections officer reads a count, not performing, just working, name after name in steady sequence with a brief pause between each. Karen sat at her desk and listened because she could not immediately process what was happening. And in the gap between stimulus and response, she heard 17 names read aloud, names she did not recognize. She opened her laptop. The reformatory maintained a public archive of historical inmate records on its museum website, a searchable database compiled from state documents. She typed the first name she had managed to remember. He was in the archive. Died at the facility in 1947. She typed the second name. Also in the archive. 1963. The voice continued reading. She began writing names down as fast as she could, her hand shaking enough that her handwriting was barely legible. Filling half a notepad page with names she was cross-referencing against the archive in real time. Every name she could check was in the database. Everyone had died at the reformatory. The voice read 31 names in the space of approximately 12 minutes. On the 32nd entry, it said Karen's full legal name, first, middle, last, in the same flat institutional cadence it had used for every name preceding it. And then the speaker went silent. Karen had a flashlight in her desk drawer, a habit formed early in her tenure at the reformatory and maintained through 4 years of occasional power. Fluctuations caused by the building's aging electrical infrastructure. She had it in her hand before the darkness had fully registered, the beam moving across the desk, the wall, the door. The door to the administrative office was closed. She crossed to it and tried the handle. It was locked. This was not standard. The administrative office door did not lock from the inside. Had no interior mechanism, was designed to remain accessible at all times for safety reasons. She confirmed this by trying the handle 3 more times, the beam of her flashlight showing the handle turning freely, but the latch not retracting, as though something on the other side was holding it in place with steady, unvarying pressure. She stood at the door for 40 seconds. She counted. Then the lights returned all at once, the full illumination of the corridor outside the frosted glass panel of the office door snapping back on, and simultaneously, every door in the administrative wing opened. Not blew open, not swung. Opened with the specific controlled motion of a door opened by a hand that knows exactly how much force is required, each one moving to approximately 45 degrees and stopping. Karen's office door included. She stood in the open doorway and looked down the corridor, every door standing open at the same angle in both directions, and the corridor was empty. She walked to the end of the wing and then back, opening every door fully and confirming each room was unoccupied. The building was empty. She drove home at 2:30 a.m., called her supervisor from the car and said she needed to be taken off solo overnight shifts. She did not say why, not in that call. She said it was a personal safety concern and left it there. The administrator asked no follow-up questions. She was moved to daytime shifts the following week. She showed us the notepad page when we spoke with her. 31 names in her own handwriting, some of them barely legible, all of them verified against the public archive. The 30-second line, her own name, was written in letters twice the size of everything else on the page, as though her hand had been pressing harder by the time it arrived there without her having consciously decided to. James was a structural engineer with 14 years of experience in decommissioned facility assessment. The specific discipline of going into buildings that are scheduled for demolition and determining whether the demolition timeline is safe given the current state of the structure, whether any unexpected complications exist in the material, whether the plan accounts for what the building has actually become over the years. It has been standing unoccupied. It is methodical, solitary work, and James was well suited to it. He was not the kind of man who assigned meaning to spaces. He was the kind of man who assigned load-bearing calculations and compressive stress tolerances and concrete integrity scores. And he found that framework more useful than most other frameworks available for understanding the world. In October of 2022, he was contracted to perform a final structural assessment of the Holbrook Correctional Facility in rural Indiana, a medium-security prison, decommissioned in 2019 and acquired by a private development company that planned to demolish the site and build a logistics center. The demolition crew was scheduled to arrive at 7 a.m. the following morning. James arrived for his final walkthrough at 9 p.m. Planning 2 to 3 hours of systematic inspection of the building's main cell blocks, terminating at the solitary confinement wing. Cell Block 6, which his earlier assessments had flagged for a specific moisture penetration issue in the foundation that he needed to confirm before. Clearing the demolition schedule, he entered Cell Block 6 at 11:03 p.m. by the timestamp on his site recorder. He was the only person in the building. He had confirmed this before entering, as was his standard practice, by walking the perimeter and checking the 3 accessible entry points. The building was secure. The power had been disconnected in 2020. He was working by flashlight and a portable lead work lamp he carried on a shoulder strap, casting a broad, cold circle of white light across the block's concrete floor. The solitary cells of Cell Block 6 were arranged in a single row of 23 cells along the left wall of the corridor. Each one a steel door with a single small viewport, a deadbolt mechanism on the exterior, and no interior handle. The deadbolts were engaged. James had confirmed this on his previous visit 10 days earlier. All 23 doors, deadbolts thrown, cells sealed. He was at the far end of the corridor, crouched near the foundation, making his moisture measurements with a calibrated probe, when he heard the first sound. A mechanical click, the specific sound of a deadbolt retracting. A sound he recognized immediately because it was the exact sound each of the 23 doors made when he had manually operated them on his earlier assessment visit. He straightened and turned. Cell 1, the door nearest the entrance to the block, was standing open. Deadbolt retracted. Door swung 6 inches inward into the cell. James stood completely still for approximately 10 seconds. He then walked the full length of the corridor to Cell 1, examined the deadbolt mechanism, found it fully retracted and showing no sign of mechanical fault, confirmed there was nothing inside the empty cell. Pushed the door shut, tested the deadbolt by hand. It engaged correctly under normal pressure and required deliberate. Forced to retract, and then walked back toward the foundation and resumed his measurements. 4 minutes and 38 seconds later, by his site recorder, Cell 2 opened. Same sound, same degree, 6 inches inward. James stood up and looked at Cell 2 for a long moment. Then he looked at Cell 1, which was closed. Then he looked at the remaining 21 cells, all closed. He made a note in his recorder. Anomalous mechanical event. Second occurrence. Investigating. noting timestamp. He walked to cell 2, examined the bolt, found it identical to cell 1, retracted cleanly, no fault. He closed cell 2. He returned to the foundation, set his phone's timer and waited. At 4 minutes and 21 seconds, cell 3 opened. James stopped writing notes, turned and stood facing the row of 23 cell doors, and did the calculation that he has told us later was the moment the experience moved from explainable to something else. He had been in the building for 72 minutes. He was alone. There were 20 more cells between him and the exit. At an interval of approximately 4.5 minutes per cell, he had roughly 90 minutes before the sequence reached him. He had enough time to leave. He was a rational man with 14 years of professional experience and no particular attachment to the idea of facing things he could not explain. He should have left. He told us this himself in those exact words. I had enough time to leave. He did not leave. He told us he does not fully understand why, but he thinks it was because some part of him needed to see what happened at cell 23. He stood in the corridor of cell block 6 at Holbrook Correctional Facility and watched 22 cell doors open in sequence, one every 4 to 5 minutes, moving from cell 1 to ward where he stood at the far end of the block. He did not attempt to close them after cell 3. He watched each door open with the same precise, deliberate motion, 6 inches inward, stop, and he recorded each time stomp and made notes in the site recorder in a voice he described as considerably calmer than he actually felt, the professional reflex taking over. The trained part of his mind doing its job while the rest of him tried to understand what was happening. At cell 19, the PA speaker mounted near the ceiling at the exit end of the corridor, system that had been without power since 2020. Wiring cut at the breaker level as part of the decommissioning process produced a sound. A low hum, analog and warm, the kind of sound an old speaker makes when it comes to life after a long time without power, the electromagnetic equivalent of clearing a throat, and then it said his name, not his professional name, the shortened version he used on site documents and business cards. His full legal name, including a middle name he had not used since childhood, a name that appeared on his birth certificate and his original social security card, and nowhere that had any connection to Holbrook Correctional Facility or anyone associated with it. The voice was flat, institutional, identical in cadence to a corrections officer reading a count. It said his name once. Then cell 23 opened. James does not remember leaving the building. The demolition crew found him at 7:15 a.m. the following morning, seated on the ground outside the main entrance, with his back against the exterior wall, his site recorder in his hand, his equipment intact. He was uninjured, was coherent. His last recorded timestamp from inside cell block 6 was 1:44 a.m., approximately 5 minutes after cell 23 opened. He has no memory of the 5 hours between that timestamp and 7:15 a.m., not of leaving the building, not of sitting down against the wall, not of waiting through a cold Indiana night in the open air, with no phone call made, no alarm raised, no message left for anyone. The demolition proceeded on schedule. James filed his clearance report from a coffee shop 2 miles from the site, drove home, and spent 3 days not answering his phone. He told us he still does structural assessments. He told us he no longer takes solo overnight assignments. And he told us that the thing that stays with him, the detail that has never resolved itself into anything he can put down, is that the voice that said his name on a dead speaker in an empty building was not wrong. It had the right name. Every syllable of it. And it said it with the flat, practiced certainty of something that had been waiting for a very long time to say it to the right person. 3 facilities, 3 night shifts. 3 encounters with something that the official record, the incident logs and maintenance requests and clearance forms, was simply not built to contain. Angola is still operating, still processing inmates, still running the night shift on Tier D. The Ohio State Reformatory is open for tours on weekends and hosts ghost investigation events in October. The Holbrook Correctional Facility no longer exists. The demolition was completed in March of 2023. The structure razed to the foundation, the site cleared for the logistics center that stands there today. Whatever was in cell block 6 at 1:44 a.m. on a Tuesday in October of 2022, whatever opened 23 doors in sequence and set a name on a dead speaker, it had no building left to occupy by spring. We do not know what that means. We don't know if it means anything at all. But James told us something at the end of his account that we have thought about many times since he said it. He said that sitting outside Holbrook in the cold at 7 a.m., watching the demolition crew arrive and not being able to tell them what had happened inside the night before, was the loneliest he had ever felt. Right. Because whatever he had been in the presence of in that corridor, it had known his name. And there is something profoundly, unsettlingly human about a thing that takes the time to learn your name before it decides you should hear it. If you work nights in a building that carries history, if you know the particular weight of a place that has held people who could not leave, and if you have experienced something on that shift that no maintenance report has ever adequately explained, we want to hear from you. Leave your account in the comments below. We read every single one. We take every single one seriously. Subscribe to True Terror Files official new horror every week. Long format stories built for the hours when the house gets quiet and the dark gets loud. And some of the accounts still coming are the ones that took the longest to tell because the people who lived them needed time to be sure anyone was actually listening. Hit the like button if tonight's stories got into your walls. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Check your doors. Every single one. Good night.